They had lived their lives shaped by fear and belief, molded by propaganda that taught them the enemy was merciless. And yet, as the transport ship crept through the cold San Francisco Bay waters on that September morning of 1945, the women aboard trembled not from the sea breeze, but from anticipation of torture that never came. Because in their minds, American soldiers were supposed to be monsters, figures without compassion who would spit upon them and tear at their dignity. But what awaited them on shore was not cruelty. It was something so profoundly opposite that it fractured their understanding of war before they even set foot on American soil. And as the fog parted just enough to reveal the towering structure of the Golden Gate Bridge, silhouetted against a gray sky, many of them held their breath, some whispering prayers under their breath, while others clutched tattered bags with whatever scraps of belongings they had. Nurses, clerks, translators, all at once part of the machinery of the Imperial Japanese Army, not reduced to weakened figures whose faces showed more exhaustion than defiance, and with every passing moment their anxiety climbed, because no one had explained what surrender meant when there was no dignity left to protect. They only knew what they were told, that to fall into enemy hands was to invite fates far worse than death. Yet the moment the gangway descended with the clatter of metal against metal and figures in American uniforms appeared, the atmosphere shifted in a way none of them were prepared for. The soldiers standing there did not look like the brutes depicted in Japanese propaganda reels. Instead, they looked like ordinary men, relaxed even, conversing casually among themselves, some smiling faintly as if unaware that the women watching them believed that they might be executed at any second. And when one soldier raised his hand in a simple wave toward the ship, a gesture that held no malice, no threat, merely acknowledgement, shock rippled through the group like a current, because such friendliness made no sense coming from those they thought were beasts. And even as they walked in single file down the ramp, following the translator who spoke in a calm and fluent Japanese, assuring that they were under Geneva Convention protection and no harm would come, each step felt heavier, laden with disbelief rather than fear of violence, because this kindness, this serenity, felt like a deception more dangerous than physical brutality, as if something inside them understood that the real challenge awaiting them was not suffering. It was the unraveling of what they believed about honor, loyalty, and enemies. Inside the processing building, the warmth and faint floral scent in the air clashed violently with their internal turmoil as female American nurses with composed expressions instructed them to disrobe for medical inspection, provoking waves of humiliation among women raised to hold modesty as sacred. And yet, as they reluctantly complied, turning away from strangers' eyes, the nurses' behavior did not confirm their fears. There was no derision, no harshness, only methodical courtesy, towels offered gently, directions given softly, and as warm water cascaded down their bodies in the shower room, many of them stood motionless, stunned by the luxury of hot water that in wartime Japan had long disappeared. Others began to wash slowly, tears mingling with the steam in the air, because the simple act of being allowed to feel clean again was more overwhelming than any interrogation ever could be. And when they exited, wrapped in towels, and were given clean clothing, along with basic necessities, something inside them shifted. Not entirely, not aloud, but silently, dangerously, like a foundation beginning to crack. Lunch that followed felt surreal, because seated in a spacious dining hall with white cloth-covered tables and plates filled with more food than they had seen in years, their bodies recoiled not from hunger, but from disbelief. roasted chicken glistening under gravy, soft bread accompanied by butter, vegetables steaming, milk alongside coffee, and no one dared to eat until one of them, hands trembling, took a tentative bite. And when that taste burst across her tongue, rich and real, her composed exterior collapsed, and she wept openly, triggering others to finally eat, some slowly as if the food might vanish if they blinked, others desperately as if consuming every morsel could fill the emptiness left by war and starvation. And with every bite they felt both relief and the profound, suffocating guilt for those left behind in what remained of their homeland, because they were eating like guests while their families, their children, their parents were scouring ruins for scraps. And this realization was so agonizing that some pushed their plates aside, while others continued, unable to resist survival even at the cost of shame. That night, as they lay on real beds with frames and mattresses, wrapped in blankets that had no holes or stains, the sound of American vehicles, distant conversations, and unfamiliar music drifting through the cold air forced them into a silence far deeper than fear. For their bodies had begun to feel comfort, and comfort in enemy territory was never part of any lesson they had been taught. So they stared at ceilings and whispered to themselves questions they could not say out loud to others, questions about enemies, about mercy, about what surrender truly meant if it came wrapped in kindness instead of degradation. And over the next days, as they adjusted to a routine of meals served with precision, work assignments that did not involve suffering, but rather manageable tasks like laundry or hospital duties, even earnings in camp currency that allowed them to buy items like chocolate or hand lotion, the dissonance intensified because kindness felt like betrayal of everything they had sacrificed, and whispers in the night slowly shifted from fear of torture to fear of losing the beliefs that had sustained them in war. Letters from home heightened the turmoil, describing hunger, collapse, scattered families, children wasting away, and while they read these letters in the safety of their barracks, surrounded by warmth and sustenance, the guilt became almost unbearable, and yet they could not stop accepting the comforts placed before them each day, because human bodies cannot reject survival indefinitely just to protect ideology. And so the true conflict began, not between nations, but between identity and experience, between what they were told was honorable and what they witnessed in the form of ordinary decency from those they expected to be evil. And although some women resisted this cognitive intrusion by rejecting conversation or refusing eye contact with Americans, their numbers dwindled over time. Because reality was slow but relentless, and with every small kindness offered by soldiers or nurses without expectation, without manipulation, simply because they believed basic dignity should not be conditional, the protective armor of propaganda began to erode, and no battle or interrogation could have inflicted such piercing transformation as the steady revelation that their suffering had come from within their own ideology, far more than from external enemies. By the time frost appeared on the windows and commands were issued to provide extra blankets and increase heating for prisoner quarters, one woman quietly declared over breakfast that the same government that sent atomic fire upon their cities was now ensuring they stayed warm in winter. And she had no words left to reconcile the contradiction, because cruelty could be explained within war, but compassion, from conquerors to defeated prisoners, defied every narrative they had been taught. And in that contradiction lay the most dangerous weapon of all, not physical force, but the relentless demonstration through action that dignity might transcend borders, that humanity could survive even in a barracks of former enemies, and that realization was precisely the truth many of them were not prepared to face. Yet it continued unveiling itself, one small encounter at a time, silently dismantling everything they thought to find strength, loyalty, and honor.
They woke each morning to the gentle bell that marked the beginning of another day inside a prison that felt disturbingly more like refuge than confinement. And as the women folded their bedding with habitual precision inherited from military discipline, they could not ignore how their bodies had grown stronger, how the hollows in their cheeks had softened, how the deep fatigue etched into their eyes during wartime service had begun to ease. And it was precisely this physical restoration that tormented their minds the most, because the sight of health returning in captivity stood in brutal contrast to the images described in the thinning letters from Japan, where entire cities lay in ruin and families starved amid rubble. And with every spoonful of oatmeal sweetened with brown sugar, every slice of toast spread with jam, every cup of coffee served steaming before them, the psychological weight of privilege in the midst of their nation's agony pressed deeper into their conscience like an invisible blade. And yet they ate because their bodies demanded survival, even if their hearts recoiled, understanding instinctively that starvation would not lift the burden of guilt nor bring back the past they had lost. And meanwhile, the Americans moved among them with a mixture of professionalism and unscripted humanity that made no sense through the lens of propaganda they'd been fed. Soldiers casually greeting prisoners with nods or shared jokes through translators, as though war lines dissolved the moment swords were lowered, and nurses speaking gently even when language barriers remained, offering not only treatment but presence. And in this environment, work assignments, tasks that many expected would be grueling or degrading, turned out to be structured with fairness and even consideration. And so women who had prepared themselves mentally for forced hard labor found themselves instead folding linens, helping with cooking preparations, cataloging supplies, or assisting in hospital wards under supervision that felt more collaborative than authoritarian. Those assigned to the hospital watched American medical personnel treat wounded soldiers with care, saw the efficiency of equipment they had never encountered in Japanese field hospitals, and sometimes witnessed an American doctor gently adjust a prisoner's bandage with the same attention he gave to his own men, which forced a realization that medical ethics here extended beyond allegiance to uniform. And this stunned women who had been taught that the enemy viewed their lives as expendable, and yet, in quiet corners of corridors or shared spaces, truths too painful to face publicly began to slip through cracks in their thoughts, that perhaps the empire they once believed in with unwavering loyalty had valued obedience and sacrifice more than human life, and that perhaps the Americans, their sworn enemy, operated from a philosophy that placed some measure of worth on the individual. And in that possibility lurked the beginning of a new kind of pain, because to accept that meant acknowledging that ideology, not nationality, defined the treatment they received. And if that ideology came from those who had bombed their cities, the paradox was unbearable. Conversations whispered at night in the dim light of barracks evolved from questions of physical survival to moral reckoning. Women debating whether kindness from conquerors was strategic manipulation designed to dismantle their convictions, or evidence of a worldview fundamentally different from their own. And as days turned into weeks, the answer grew more difficult to deny, because small gestures repeated without fanfare carried truth louder than speeches, like when an American guard, noticing a woman rubbing her arms in the chill of early morning, silently handed her an extra pair of socks, or when an off-duty soldier used broken Japanese to ask if the jazz record player in their recreation room worked, and offered to bring more music if the women wished. And these moments did not feel like propaganda or tactical persuasion. They felt like simple, uncalculated acts of consideration. And that authenticity unsettled them more deeply than any psychological warfare could have. The presence of chocolate in the canteen became a powerful symbol of this contradiction, not because it represented luxury, but because it was offered without spite to those who only weeks before were considered contributors to a war machine. And as one woman unwrapped her purchased bar slowly, breaking it into squares and distributing them among fellow prisoners, tears streamed silently down her face, because the sweetness was not merely flavor. It was the taste of a truth she struggled to accept, that this enemy provided comfort her homeland could not. And with that taste came agony, because while her tongue registered sugar and cocoa, her mind conjured the image of her younger sibling, hungry in the crushed remnants of what was once home. And no moral justification could reconcile the two. The internal divisions among the prisoners became increasingly visible as the psychological strain intensified, some clinging fiercely to the remnants of indoctrination, insisting that every kindness was a calculated ploy, that weakness was being sown to exploit them, that refusing connection was the only way to maintain dignity, and these women sat apart, eating mechanically, eyes cold, impenetrable, while others began slowly to accept that humanity could exist beyond national borders. Though accepting it did not erase pain, it amplified it, like pressure on a wound. Because to recognize kindness from the enemy forced them to confront that perhaps kindness had been absent where they had expected loyalty, and that betrayal had not come from a foreign uniform, but from the leaders who had demanded sacrifice with no intention of safeguarding those who obeyed. Nightly debates tested loyalties not to country but to truth, voices rising softly in the darkness. One woman insisting that honor meant holding fast even when confronted with opposing evidence, another countering that honor without compassion was hollow, a relic of a system that valued obedience more than life. And occasionally someone would mention the brutality of the war, the bombings, the casualties, and silence would fall. Because acknowledging American mercy did not erase American violence, and that duality weighed heavily, particularly among those who remembered the firestorms over Tokyo or who had seen the aftermath of bombings firsthand, and reconciling kindness with destruction seemed impossible. Yet the camp environment forced them to attempt just that every single day. The turning point emerged steadily rather than dramatically when conversations ceased to revolve around whether the Americans were tricking them and instead shifted to what it meant that they were not. And one morning, as frost melted on windows and women sat with their steaming cups of coffee in silence that felt less tense than before, a thought arose unspoken but widely understood that the power of their captors lay not in physical dominance, but in their freedom to extend dignity without diminishing authority, and that seeing enemies treated with humanity revealed something terrifying and liberating, that cruelty was not necessary to maintain control, and that strength could manifest as mercy rather than punishment. And as weeks passed, laughter occasionally surfaced softly among the women while folding linens or preparing vegetables in the kitchen. Not joyful laughter, but the subdued, cautious kind that arises when tension releases briefly, and even those who resisted most fiercely could not entirely shield themselves from witnessing moments where shared humanity overshadowed differences. Like the day an American nurse struggled to pronounce a Japanese phrase and cracked a smile at her own error, prompting the prisoner she was assisting to gently correct her pronunciation. And for a brief instant, both women smiled without ideological filters, simply two individuals interacting with mutual respect. And such moments, however fleeting, carried the weight of irreversible change. The Americans, largely unaware of the internal storms raging within the prisoners, continued their routines with the calm certainty of those who believed they were merely following procedure.
but what they saw as adherence to regulation manifested to the women as evidence of a system where dignity was institutionalized rather than selectively offered. And that realization sparked the most profound internal reckoning among them, because it forced them to consider that perhaps the beliefs instilled in them about national loyalty were flawed if they required denying truth when truth stood plainly before them, and that perhaps survival meant not surrendering identity, but reshaping it to accommodate lessons learned through experience rather than inherited through instruction. And thus the transformation deepened quietly with each passing day, as the enemy's kindness dismantled not their resilience, but the illusions they had been taught to protect. And in doing so, revealed that the battlefield they now navigated was no longer physical, but psychological. And there was no surrender that could be signed to end it.
As winter settled over the camp, with its sharp breath and brittle mornings, the emotional divide among the women widened before it quietly began to close, not through any resolution or agreement, but through exhaustion, as even resistance demanded energy, and the energy for ideological defiance slowly dwindled in the face of consistent acts of compassion that required no reciprocation, no compliance, only acknowledgement. And this acknowledgement came reluctantly at first, then gradually with fewer whispered protests, and one morning, when the women awoke to discover additional blankets neatly folded at the end of each bed, following the commander's announcement days earlier, many stared at them in silence, because that small foresight, that preparation to protect them from discomfort without request or negotiation, struck deeper than any kindness thus far, not because it was grand, but because it was ordinary. And ordinary kindness was the one thing they were wholly unprepared to confront, having been taught that enemies do not care unless they seek to manipulate, having believed for so long that mercy only appears from weakness. Yet these men, their captors, clearly did not treat kindness as weakness, and that contradiction unraveled something fundamental in the prisoner's understanding of power. Conversations late at night evolved from tense exchanges to reflective murmurs, increasingly less defensive, more introspective, as women questioned not only what they believed about the Americans, but how their own understanding of patriotism had become entangled with obedience to authority, even when that authority abandoned them. And during one such evening dialogue, Tomoko, a woman whose calm demeanor carried influence, though she rarely raised her voice, spoke gently of books she'd read before wartime censorship, books that described democracy not as an absence of order, but as loyalty to people rather than systems. And this idea resonated quietly, especially among women who had served within the rigid hierarchy of the imperial structure, where questioning orders equated shame, regardless of the moral cost. And although no one openly endorsed her words, silence that followed suggested contemplation rather than dismissal. Gradually, the women began to interact with their captors beyond necessity, maintaining distance yet no longer recoiling from casual greetings and occasionally offering simple nods or brief smiles, gestures that seemed insignificant, but to those who had once feared every American breath represented cruelty, were monumental steps towards acknowledging a shared humanity without surrendering cultural identity. And this internal opening allowed for the most unexpected phenomenon, the appearance of hope, fragile and tentative, but present nonetheless. And this hope did not revolve around return to Japan, for returning represented fear as much as longing, but rather around the idea that perhaps life after war could involve more than survival of the body, that perhaps survival of self was possible if they carried forward the lessons forced upon them by circumstance, lessons not of submission, but of clarity. The Christmas celebration marked a turning point, not because of ceremony or generosity, but because it placed the women in a situation where they could no longer ignore the authenticity of their captors' intent, as American soldiers decorated a tree with lights and ornaments in a hall that had never been intended to host enemy prisoners, and invited them to share in what they called a time of peace and goodwill. And although many attended out of curiosity or obligation to appear compliant, Moose did not anticipate what would happen when they were handed small wrapped gifts, each package containing practical items like soap, combs, mirrors, and sometimes chocolate wrapped in bright paper as if they were not prisoners of war, but guests in need of comfort. And with that gesture, something profound ruptured internally among many, because it was one thing to be fed and clothed out of obligation, quite another to be given tokens of care without expectation. And as Co sat holding a bar of soap and a mirror in her lap, objects she had used countless times in her former life, yet never seen presented with such simple dignity, she felt an emotional tide rise that she could no longer restrain. Tears flowing not for the gift itself, but for what it symbolized, the irreversible understanding that those she had been taught to hate were not embodiments of evil, but individuals capable of mercy in the aftermath of destruction. The commander, startled by the depth of gratitude expressed by Tomoko when she bowed publicly and thanked the Americans for treating them as human beings, dismissed his role with an awkward reply that they were merely following the Geneva Convention, not performing any special favor. And yet his discomfort betrayed the truth that even he sensed the impact of his choices extended beyond compliance. And the women knew this too, because international regulations may dictate treatment standards, but they do not dictate warmth of gestures, nor the thoughtfulness that prompted additional blankets, or the inclusion of prisoners in holiday celebrations. And so slowly the internal wall built from propaganda collapsed, not through debate or argument, but through lived experience. Each act of kindness a chisel against its foundation. Yet acknowledging the truth did not simplify their internal struggle, rather it intensified it, for admitting that the enemy could be humane forced them to confront betrayal from the very system that once defined loyalty, and thus guilt grew not weaker but sharper, because how could they justify serving an ideology that failed to protect its people while their adversaries offered basic dignity? And this guilt manifested differently among them, some responding with silent acceptance, others with emotional breakdowns, like the moment when Co, overwhelmed by her reflection in a cabinet door that revealed her healthier than before the war, collapsed to the floor and sobbed uncontrollably, her grief too vast to articulate, for she could not reconcile thriving in captivity when freedom in Japan had never gifted her such vitality. And when Nurse Helen sat beside her without judgment, without trying to soothe her sorrow, simply acknowledging her pain, that presence became the moment Co's worldview shattered entirely, because mercy from those she once saw as subhuman meant the propaganda's greatest lie had not been about the enemy's cruelty, but about the enemy's capacity for empathy. Following this collapse, Co addressed the women in the barracks with measured conviction that signaled the culmination of her transformation, stating quietly that she looked better now as a prisoner than she ever had as a free citizen of Japan. And this was not a testament to American superiority, but an indictment of Japanese leadership that demanded sacrifice without protection, obedience without support. And her words rippled through the silence, not as a dismissal of homeland, but as an assertion that truth must be confronted regardless of national identity. And although some resisted, unwilling to accept that the ideology they fought for was flawed, most recognized the validity of her pain having felt the same dissonance when they saw their faces reflected in mirrors that had returned color and life once drained by starvation and stress. The shift did not manifest in overt allegiance to American ways, but in subtle changes in behavior, such as seeking to learn English phrases not solely for function, but for genuine dialogue, or engaging with soldiers and nurses on topics beyond duty, perhaps asking about their families or sharing small anecdotes about life before the war. And these exchanges did not erase wounds, but acknowledge them, creating a fragile bridge between former adversaries built not from forgiveness, but from comprehension that the capacity to inflict suffering and to offer care can coexist within the same hands. And this recognition planted seeds of introspection that many would carry long after departure, shaping how they raised children, how they navigated relationships, how they rebuilt their shattered lives. As news of impending repatriation spread in early spring, dread rather than relief swept through the barracks. Because, though the women longed for reunion with family, they feared the return to hunger and ruin. And deeper still, they feared the moment their loved ones' eyes would meet theirs and read in their faces the undeniable signs of nourishment and well-being gained among the enemy, and this fear manifested in hushed confessions that they did not wish to voice aloud, admissions that captivity in America had granted them safety their homeland failed to provide, and that preferring survival did not make them traitors, but made them human, though they knew society might not understand, and thus they prepared not only for the physical journey, but for the emotional toll of returning as women transformed by the unsettling truth that kindness can exist where least expected, and that sometimes survival demands questioning everything one was once taught to hold sacred, even when the answers offer no comfort. The final days before repatriation unfolded with a tension unlike the fear that marked their arrival, because what the women experienced now was not terror of unknown brutality, but the anxiety of leaving behind the environment that, despite its origin in defeat, had become a space where they rediscovered fragments of self-worth stripped away by war. And as they stood beneath pale spring sunlight waiting for their departure schedule, each woman carried an internal conflict far more complex than any they had felt in uniform, because the physical freedom that awaited them across the Pacific was overshadowed by the psychological burden of returning as someone irrevocably changed, and the fear they now felt revolved around how to step back into a world that no longer reflected who they had become, and what it meant to face families who had endured devastation without the shelter and nourishment these former prisoners ironically received under captivity. In quiet conversations behind barrack walls, women admitted their dread, not of hardship but of judgment, fearing that their restored bodies and stabilized minds would be seen as evidence of complicity rather than survival, and that their stories of American kindness would be met with disbelief or even condemnation, because to praise the enemy, no matter the truth, risked being branded unpatriotic by a society still mourning and seeking someone to blame. And so they spoke in whispers about strategies for concealing the full extent of their recovery, some even considering skipping meals before departure to appear thinner, others planning to avoid mentioning camp routines or holiday celebrations. And Coe, now recognized as a voice of painful clarity, warned them softly that pretending they had suffered equally would betray the moral evolution they had gained. Yet her words landed like lead because while they understood her meaning intellectually, emotionally they were unprepared to endanger themselves in a fractured homeland that seldom rewarded honesty over conformity. Packing belongings provided by the camp, which included donated clothes, hygiene items, letters written by American staff wishing them peace, felt surreal because each item represented protection they had received from those they once believed would discard them. And many women considered leaving these things behind not out of discomfort, but because they knew they could not explain them at home without igniting suspicion. And in that act of deciding what to take and what to hide, they realized that their journey back would require the same discipline they once used in serving the empire, except now, instead of suppressing fear, they would suppress truth. And that realization cut deeply, because the transformation they had undergone felt wasted if it could not be expressed beyond the confines of the camp. As the day of departure approached, interactions between prisoners and Americans became more personal, though still restrained by regulation, and soldiers tasked with escort duties offered quiet farewells, some awkwardly, some warmly, and one nurse wrote a small note to Tomoko expressing hope that she would find peace, and reminding her that strength lies not in silence, but in compassion. And this note moved her profoundly, not because of its words alone, but because it reflected the belief of someone who had no stake in her future beyond genuine care. And that sort of unforced empathy had been rare in her life, even before the war. And now it became a seed she vowed to protect, even if she had to shield it beneath guarded expression upon return. Before leaving the camp perimeter, the women gathered for a final assembly, and the American commander addressed them briefly, thanking them for their cooperation and wishing for their safe journey home, but his voice momentarily caught when he acknowledged he could not imagine the challenges awaiting them in their homeland, and that despite their roles in the war, he respected the resilience they had shown, and hearing acknowledgement not as prisoners, but as women who endured circumstances beyond their control, stunned the group. And several bowed deeply without being prompted, a gesture not of submission, but of mutual recognition that transcended victor and vanquished. And as they boarded the transport that would begin their journey to Yokohama, many carried with them not anger or defiance, but a quiet and complicated gratitude. The crossing of the Pacific mirrored their emotional transition, turbulent and uncertain, and, during the voyage, the women adhered to unspoken rules about not discussing the camp in detail, understanding that their words could be overheard and misinterpreted by officials tasked with evaluation upon arrival. And they practiced simplified accounts of their time in America, focusing on neutrality and avoiding mention of comforts or kindnesses, framing their experience as procedural rather than personal. And this rehearsal underscored the tragedy of their transformation, because the most profound truths they had encountered could not be spoken aloud where they were heading, and thus they were forced to carry them in silence. Upon arrival at the devastated port of Yokohama, the smell of ash and stagnant seawater replaced the crisp marine air they had grown accustomed to in California, and before their eyes stood landscapes warped by destruction, skeletal remains of buildings, and crowds of civilians worn by years of rationing and grief. And the contrast struck them like a physical blow, because the suffering their minds had evoked through letters could not compare to the reality that stood before them, and it was then that the full weight of their emotional dislocation settled in their chests, as if the air itself had grown too dense to breathe, and they realized the true journey was not across the ocean, but through the gulf that now separated their lived experience from that of the people awaiting them. Repatriation officials processed them mechanically, examining medical forms provided by the Americans that stated they were in good condition, and the women watched as these assessments elicited reactions of surprise or skepticism, because healthy bodies did not align with expected narratives of wartime suffering. and some officials questioned whether they had received preferential treatment due to cooperation with enemy authorities, a suggestion that stung deeply because cooperation had nothing to do with the care they received. Yet accusations carried power regardless of truth, and thus the women remained silent, allowing the scrutiny to pass without resistance. Reuniting with families was both a moment of profound relief and aching dissonance, because though tears flowed freely upon embrace, the distance between their internal reality and the expectation placed upon them settled immediately. And Ko, when held by her sister who had survived the Tokyo fire bombings, filled both overwhelming love and crushing isolation, as her sister's body bore the scars of deprivation, while hers, though emotionally fractured, appeared physically whole. And this disparity made her shrink within herself, reluctant to speak, hesitant to share, not because she did not want to connect, but because she feared her truth would inflict further pain or provoke resentment. And so she did what many of the women did. She smiled gently, said little, and let this silence mask what she could not express. The months that followed reintegration were marked by subtle acts of withdrawal among these former prisoners, not from life, but from open conversation about their captivity. And while they contributed to the rebuilding of their homes and communities, they did so with an internal quietness born not from trauma alone, but from the knowledge that their most significant emotional journey had taken place among those considered enemies. And this reality could not be shared without consequence. And thus they became guardians of an unspoken narrative, protecting it not out of disloyalty to their country, but out of loyalty to the truth that had shaped them in ways wartime ideology could not comprehend. Some women married. Some pursued careers made possible by post-war reforms. Some even corresponded quietly with American nurses or fellow POWs they had met, though such contact was rare and often concealed. And over time their lives blended into society's recovery. Yet those who knew them closely could sense an indelible difference, a steadiness that did not resemble resignation, but clarity. As if having endured the contradictions of war and captivity, they now understood that resilience was not forged from obedience, but from empathy, and that strength derived from acknowledging humanity in others, even in adversaries, was not weakness, but the foundation upon which peace could begin. The camp experience remained largely unspoken in public discourse, overshadowed by broader narratives of defeat, reconstruction, and national pride, and many women died without passing on the depth of their transformation. But a few, later in life, shared fragments of their story with younger generations, often framing the Americans they encountered not as saviors or oppressors, but as individuals who demonstrated that dignity should not be conditional upon identity, and that lesson became their legacy, quietly influencing the way their children and grandchildren viewed former enemies, shaping a perspective that valued compassion over dogma. And so the story of their captivity, once anticipated as a tale of suffering at the hands of the enemy, evolved instead into a testament of how unexpected kindness can become the most powerful catalyst for introspection, challenging deeply rooted beliefs and revealing that survival is not merely the continuation of breath, but the willingness to confront truth, even when truth arrives wearing the uniform of those once feared. And in carrying this understanding forward, these women became silent architects of a more humane outlook, proving that the greatest transformations are often those lived quietly, without recognition, yet enduring in the unseen shifts within the human heart. Years passed quietly after their return. And while Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes of war with remarkable determination, the former prisoners moved through post-war life with a composure shaped not by triumph, but by the silent strength born from surviving contradiction. And though their experiences remained mostly unspoken, time did not erode the lessons etched into their memory. It only deepened their understanding of how the human spirit adapts when confronted with truths that unraveled long-held convictions. And many of these women found themselves leading lives of unexpected influence within their homes, communities, and, in some cases, workplaces. Not through loud declarations or political engagement, but through the subtle manner in which they treated others, especially during moments of conflict or hardship, always recalling that compassion shown by an enemy during captivity taught them more about resilience than any wartime slogan ever did. Ko, whose breakdown in the camp had marked a pivotal moment for many, settled into life as a school teacher in Tokyo, and she carried her transformations into the classroom, prioritizing not obedience but curiosity, encouraging children to ask questions and seek clarity even when answers were uncomfortable. And although she never openly discussed her time in America, those who studied under her later recalled that she emphasized empathy as much as knowledge, teaching quietly that strength without mercy is hollow, that true progress arises not from conformity but from insight. And in doing so, she honored the compassion she once witnessed in unexpected places without ever needing to disclose its origins. Tomoko, who had sparked thought in the barracks with references to suppressed literature, went on to write poetry under a pseudonym, and while her verses never directly referenced captivity or the Americans, their quiet reflections on humanity, resilience, and the value of soft-spoken acts resonated with readers searching for meaning in the post-war era. And though she never became renowned, her work found its way into local circles where intellectuals and survivors gathered, her lines subtly challenging the notion that dignity is bestowed by authority rather than held inherently by individuals, even those deemed enemies. And thus she contributed to the emotional recovery of a society hesitant to face aspects of its past that did not align with national narrative. Others married and raised families, some becoming caregivers to aging relatives, some working in textile factories, hospitals, and administrative offices, all living outwardly ordinary lives. Yet within each persisted a recognition that the harshest truths they carried were not the physical ones of deprivation, but the moral ones of disparity, that they had been traded with a level of dignity and health preservation by the enemy that their own government had failed to provide. And this reality remained too complex to voice publicly in a society still grappling with its identity after surrender. But rather than let it fester as resentment, many women channeled it into actions that advocated, quietly, for the well-being of others, a way of honoring what they had received without betraying the sorrow that accompanied it. They understood more deeply than most that suffering does not reside solely in physical hardship, but in the contradictions that force a person to question everything they believed defined honor. And so they pushed their children to think beyond boundaries of national ideology, teaching them that the world is not cleanly divided between friend and foe. And their instruction helped raise a generation that proved more receptive to reconciliation efforts, more willing to engage with former enemies in partnership rather than rivalry. And though history rarely attributes such cultural shifts to unspoken experiences of former prisoners, the impact of their transformed perspective rippled quietly through the post-war decades. In the years following the signing of peace treaties and international recovery initiatives, some of the women received requests from historians or researchers seeking personal accounts of Japanese prisoners held in the United States. But most declined, not out of shame, but because they feared their stories would be misused to portray the Americans as moral victors rather than individuals acting according to principles they'd believed transcended war. And because speaking truth without nuance could inadvertently dishonor those in Japan who had suffered without such protection. And so they guarded their stories unless they encountered someone who asked not with academic detachment, but with genuine intention to understand. And in a few such rare instances late in life, they offered fragments of their memory, always framing them not as testimony of American righteousness, but as evidence of what becomes possible when compassion overrides ideology. It was in such a setting, decades later, at a quiet community gathering commemorating the women who served as wartime support personnel, that Tomoko, frail with age yet calm in demeanor, finally referenced her captivity in America, speaking slowly to a group of young women studying international relations, telling them that her greatest lesson from the war did not come from victory or defeat, but from discovering that dignity can survive conflict if preserved by those willing to see beyond uniform. And her words moved the audience, not because they glorified former adversaries, but because they affirmed the possibility of peace built upon recognition of human worth rather than enforced compliance. Ko, nearing the end of her life, entrusted her final thoughts to her granddaughter in a letter she requested remain sealed until after her passing. And in it she wrote that her survival in captivity had nothing to do with surrender, but everything to do with revelation, that the moment she collapsed before the American nurse was the moment she saw clearly that humanity does not wear national colors, and that she chose thereafter to live not as a loyalist to ideology, but as a loyalist to truth. And she encouraged her granddaughter to build her life upon values that protect dignity rather than diminish it, even when doing so requires standing against prevailing opinion. And this letter, though only seen by one pair of eyes at first, eventually became a point of reflection shared in private among family members, helping them understand the quiet steadiness that had defined Ko throughout their lives. Most of the women did not live to see the full evolution of relations between Japan and the United States, nor the rise of generations that questioned wartime narratives with open-mindedness, but their influence lived on in quiet gestures, in the way they diffused conflict with humility, supported neighbors through hardship without judgment, and raised children to value critical thought over blind acceptance. And thus their legacy, though seldom publicly acknowledged, became part of the cultural maturity that allowed post-war reconciliation to unfold with greater depth and sincerity. In the end, their story remains largely invisible in official archives, overshadowed by grander political discourse and military records, but its truth persists where real change often takes root, in unspoken shifts of conscience, in the decisions made during ordinary days that reflect the extraordinary lessons learned in extreme circumstances. And if one listens closely, one can sense their presence in the quiet moments where empathy prevails over resentment, or someone chooses understanding rather than condemnation. The lives of these women stand as a testament to the complex nature of survival, showing that resilience is not measured by refusal to change, but by a willingness to evolve when confronted with truth, and that the greatest strength lies not in holding to belief when evidence disproves it, but in having the courage to let that belief go and rebuild oneself around what has been genuinely experienced, even when that truth arrives under the flag of the adversary. Their transformation was not betrayal, it was liberation from a blindness imposed by propaganda. And though they carried sorrow always for those left behind and for the pain inflicted by war, they also carried the understanding that compassion has the power to outlast conflict.
And in their quiet lives, their soft-spoken influence, and the way they chose to guide others with insight rather than bitterness, they affirmed that the greatest victories of war may not be written in treaties or borders, but etched into the hearts of those who discover that humanity can persist even in a prison. And so their story, though rarely spoken, remains alive in the way future generations learn to look at former enemies with eyes that ask not who was right, but how do we move forward? And this shift, born from experiences that were supposed to break them, instead shaped them into vessels of wisdom that helped steer society toward peace, proving that the greatest legacies are not always the loudest, but the quiet truth carried forward by those willing to let kindness redefine them. Thus, the women who once stepped trembling onto American soil expecting cruelty found instead an unexpected path to clarity. And that clarity, living silently within them long after repatriation, became their final act of strength. Not as soldiers, not as prisoners, but as human beings who discovered that in the aftermath of devastation, the simplest acts of dignity can reframe the meaning of survival. And in doing so, they became proof that even in the darkest chapters of history, compassion can emerge as the most powerful form of resistance.